So good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Hallett, Merit Rising Director for the Courtauld. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth and the last of the series of professorial lectures that we've been hosting over the past few months. Some of you, quite a lot of you I think, have been here for them all. If so, you'll know that these events have been joyous affairs in which you've been able to celebrate the achievements and the talents of a number of our senior colleagues while hearing them share and reflect on their newest research. So far, we've enjoyed listening to and spending time with Professors Joe Applin, Suzanne Babai, Martin Cager-Smith, and last week, Dr. Price. And tonight, it's time for us to enjoy the company of the inimitable Professor Alixe Bovey. Now, in a moment, Tony Eastman will be introducing Alixe and describing the many contributions she has made to the Courtauld, to scholarship, and in truth, to the entire art historical sector here in the UK. Before we turn to Tony, I'd like to say a couple of things, if I may. First, I'd like to offer my thanks, and our collective thanks, to all those who have been involved in organising these professorial lectures, led by Dr. Lucy Bradnock, our Dean for Research, and Leila Bumborough, our Research Forum Programme Manager, who's been really ably assisted by DAR Techi as well, and the rest of their team. The fact that the whole series has been such a joy is in large part due to the foresight and the imagination and the professionalism of Lucy, Leila, Diego, and the entire Research Forum team, so huge thanks to them all. But secondly, I'd like to offer my own very brief appreciation of Alixe Bovey. I've known Alixe a pretty long time, around 20 years or so, I think, encountering her first of all, this is one of my most powerful memories of her, when she was appointed as an external examiner for the History of Art department at York in the mid to late 2000s, I think. Now, end of year Board of Examiners meetings, as many of you will know, are notoriously long and slow and headache-inducingly intense affairs, held in rooms that get progressively stuffier and thick with muffled stress as the hours roll on. Alixe, astonishingly, made such events ones that I would actually really look forward to, simply to revel in her extraordinary liveliness, warmth, sharpness, and wit. I can honestly say that I've never met anyone across the entirety of my life who has Alixe's verbal quickness. It's true, isn't it? All of you know that. A kind of relaxed, extemporized wizardry with words, which astounds me still, which means that no conversation with her, no conversation at all is ever boring. And it's also true, as I've come to especially appreciate since arriving here last year, that there are very few people around who are so committed to and so passionate about the institution in which they work, in which they serve, who devote so much creative, intellectual, and physical energy to what they do. Alixe, you're always fizzing, sparking, exploding with ideas and enthusiasm. You light up our lives and have played and continue to play a profoundly important role in shaping the Courtauld as an institution and as a community. For all these reasons, it feels particularly appropriate to end the series with you. So thanks very much, and thanks to you all. And now over to Tony. Thank you.
So thank you, Mark. My name's Anthony Eastman. I'm one of Alixe's colleagues and a medievalist here at the Courtauld. I think Mark's just stolen everything I was going to say. So that's a problem. But also, this introduction is going to be slightly unusually structured, and for reasons that I hope will become clear to you all, because it means I'm going to open with an apology, which is not perhaps the best place to begin, because I think I'm really what I would call on an England football night the third string goalkeeper for this occasion. And as I think there are others who are probably much better placed to be making this introduction instead of me. So first I'd like to take a moment to remember who those people are, and for us to send our best wishes, primarily I think to the person who should really be making this introduction, our colleague and Alixe's great friend, Professor Susie Nash, who can't be with us this evening because of ill health, and I know we all sent her our thoughts. Second, I think the next choice would have been one of our emeritus professors, either John Loudon or Joanna Cannon. John was Alixe's PhD supervisor, and Joanna a mentor to Alixe, well, to almost all of us who knew her at the Institute. They both, I think, have been instrumental in developing Alixe's intellectual rigor, her integrity, and her eye for detail, and her eye for the absurd. And I think John is also detained by ill health, so can't be with us, and Joanna by the weighty care duties that she's taken on. And so I think, I hope we can all send our thoughts to be with them this evening. But as a result, it means that the honour of introducing Alixe fell to me. But as I lack experience, I've never done one of these before, I looked for some advice. So in my case, as you might expect, it was from Aquinas of Antioch, the 4th century author of the Progymnasmata, a book of rhetorical exercises, including one on how to praise a person or thing for being virtuous. It sets out the following. I should describe the stock the person came from, describe their upbringing, their education, their instruction in the arts. I should describe the person's deeds, and this should be described as results of, first, their excellencies of mind, such as fortitude or prudence, their excellencies of body, such as beauty, speed, or vigour, and their excellencies of fortune, such as high position, she is deputy director after all, power, wealth, and friends. Well, the size of the audience answers that. Then it says I should make a favourable comparison to someone else to escalate your praise. So I'm working out who to pick on. And finally, I should conclude with an epilogue, which is either an exhortation to my hearers to emulate this person or a prayer. And we'll come to that at the end. However, having read all this, I then spoke to Alixe, who told me that I wasn't to say anything that would make her emotional in this introduction. And on further discussion, that seemed to boil down to one single thing to avoid, and that was anything that resembled praise. So leaves me in a quandary. However, Alixe did give me a way out. She said there were 4 things I could talk about: her height, her hair, her age, and her country of origin. Now, all of these fit the requirements of an encomium, but as you'll have seen, Aquinas really requires I deliver you more than a simple list of facts. And so what you're hearing now is structured, so there is enough waffle between anything that might be conceived of as praise to give Alixe time to recover her composure and so start the lecture in a proper frame of mind. So, returning to those 4 facts that Alixe was prepared for me to discuss. The first 2, her height and her hair, well, self-evident. The third, her age, perhaps a bit more delicate, and it sounds like I'm getting into rather clickbait. 4 facts about Alixe. You'll be amazed by number 3. So I thought I wouldn't go there. And as for the 4th, country of origin, well, that's one of Alixe's best kept secrets. No one here would ever know where she came from. But it does make me think that perhaps one final name drop should go to John Osborne, another Courtauld alumnus who taught Alixe medieval art history at the University of Victoria in New Columbia, and who I think we should blame for Alixe being with us today, set her off on her current path. So what's left for me to do then is an introduction without praise. So here we go. So Alixe has been with us at the Courtauld since 2015, after stints at the British Library and the University of Kent. She's been both a researcher and a teacher throughout, but while at the Courtauld, she's really just been a bureaucrat, a serial committee attendee, a report writer, the punch bag of governing board, among other things, in her capacities as head of research, as dean and deputy director, and at times acting as all those roles at once. But beneath that mountain of paper, Alixe has continued her research into manuscripts that goes back to her PhD thesis on the Smithfield Decretals, here medieval footnotes needed, that is of course London, British Library, Royal Manuscript, 10E4, as I think Alixe knows, and before that to Alixe's MA dissertation. And she's branched beyond that wildly into the weirder world of the Middle Ages, from giants to magic, to the very form of the cosmos, but always with a strongly erudite angle rooted in the writings of medieval theologians and scholars. And it's that Alixe that we will hear this evening. And so I won't say any more about that. But what may be less apparent to some of you is her contribution in other fields. And just to reassure you, Alixe, this isn't praise. This is merely a list of things that happened in meetings at which you were present. So the first, and I'm just going to pick on two for time. The first is thinking about Alixe's role as head of research here at the Courtauld. So the Research Forum had long been a powerhouse of art historical debate and education for many years when Alixe came in to take it over. But I think we would all agree that it's been transformed by her presence. So those who remember the space of the Research Forum at Somerset House will remember its refinement, most evident in the duck egg blue carpet that greeted visitors. Indeed, the carpet was so precious and wildly impractical that it had to be protected with cling film from the prying footwear of researchers before every event. And it kind of placed an expectation on how research should be done, how it could be conducted, kind of quietly, respectively, in a rather genteel manner, I think. Now compare that with the Research Forum that Alixe supervised here. I think we might call it a lino-covered action space that welcomes practice as much as polemics, and I think driven by Alixe's parallel passions for both making art and studying it, that I think drive a lot of what she does. So she wants to keep her hands dirty, I think both literally and metaphorically in her subject. But that physical transformation of the space is, I think, just a symptom of a deeper change. Because alongside that, Alixe established ResFest, that bewildering and rather heady mix of art, history, curating and conservation, mixed with conversation, but also with music, poetry, and food vans that seem to rock up somehow in the courtyard at Somerset House once a year to show just how different, how engaging, and dare I say even how exciting the Courtauld could be when it wanted to. And all that was overseen by Alixe, and I think it has really profoundly transformed the way the Courtauld has seen its relationship with the world around it, I think in ways that truly bring Samuel Courtauld's vision of art for all up to date. Now I'm giving the credit to Alixe here, because she's my boss, so it makes sense, but of course it was always the work of a team. So the research team that Mark has mentioned, the gallery, facilities, development, and many others. But I think it's fair to say that it was a team because of Alixe. It's her ability to spot talent, to bring it together and people together and to allow them to thrive that made it such a success. The second set of meetings that I want to recall have determined, I think, the shape of the audience that I'm addressing today. So when Mark's predecessor, Debbie Swallow, who's here with us this evening, was director, she set out her vision for the global aspirations that the Courtauld should have. But I think we rarely recognise what a role Alixe played in delivering that. I think the presence of the teaching of Asian and Chinese art, the establishment of posts dedicated to the teaching of Black British art and its diasporas, the reshaping of the Buddhist art programme to enable us actually to appoint experts in Buddhist art to teach it, all owe a huge amount to Alixe's ability to articulate an intellectual argument about the transformative roles of such appointments, not just about what we would teach our students, but what we would offer each other as researchers, and what we could offer more broadly as an institute to London, Britain, and beyond. It was Alixe's words for the hours she spent composing those bid documents to donors that really persuaded them to give us the seed funding that set up those posts, and I think it's made a huge difference to everything we do. Now, you can only succeed in that kind of world with that uncanny mixture of charm laced with steel, of enthusiasm underwritten by grueling hard work, and grace sharpened by just a degree of acerbity that can persuade and cajole, but always to build a foundation of support. And I think that has been at the root of everything that Alixe has achieved for us. Now, alongside this, Alixe finds time to sit on the Cathedral Fabrics Committee, discussing access to Canterbury Cathedral, the lighting of St. Paul's, or even talking to the Metropolitan of Gori, the hometown of Stalin, about how to relight an 11th century church in his diocese. And equally, she's been very heavily involved with the Association for Art History and very sensitive to and aware of the national climate of the humanities and art history in which we all operate. I think that's enough waffle. I will leave out, I will spare your blushes on the section on your life as a TV Don. Unfortunately, only 4 minutes and 13 seconds is available to watch on iPlayer rather than the full 3 hours. But we should note that as well as learning a huge amount about the medieval world from Alixe, I can also claim now a new expertise in, over recent years, barnacles, chickens, and most recently the constellation of the Pleiades. I've no idea where Alixe gets all these passions from, but they are amazing and everyone gets dragged along with them. Now, if you'll remember, the instructions from Encomium ended with two things: that favourable comparison, well, invidious to choose which one of you I would pick on. I think we all pale in comparison to Alixe. But finally, it was that exhortation or a prayer. And I thought I would just end with the prayer, which is that I pray after this, Alixe will still talk to me. So, with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Alixe Bovey to deliver her inaugural lecture, The House of Mirth, The Ethics of Laughter and Ridiculous Gothic Art. Alixe,
Paul Crossley used to introduce speakers in a similar manner so that there was absolutely no way to the introduction. So we're carrying on a glorious Baroque tradition. Thank you so much, Mark and Tony. 768 years ago, Pope Alexander IV issued a bull endorsing the decision of the Chancellor of the University of Paris to instruct Thomas Aquinas to give his inaugural lecture. Thomas had been awarded his doctorate in the medieval university system, his license to teach, the previous month. Medieval inaugurals were generally immediately following the award of the doctorate, rather than the kind of survivor's milestone that they've become today. According to Thomas's 14th century biographer, William of Tocco, Thomas didn't want to give his inaugural, yet he couldn't say no. He didn't know what to talk about. He wept, he prayed. His topic came to him in a dream. This image, painted around the time of Thomas's canonization in 1323 by the so-called master of the Dominican effigies, is, according to Lawrence B. Cantor, a complete novelty in Tuscan painting. Maybe, just tonight, we could think of this scene as Thomas giving his inaugural. Golden beams of light emanating from his text, a colleague introducing him with flattering words from the Benedictine rule, enraptured audience, defeated opponent at his feet. I don't think that's really what it is, though, so don't tell Joanna, although I think Joanna might be watching, so apologies, Joanna. So there are a lot of things that I do not have in common with Thomas Aquinas. The Pope did not make me give this lecture, but Mark and Lucy did. So thank you very much to Lucy Bradnock and Mark Hallett, who organized this series, and also to the other inauguralists who are proving a very difficult act to follow, Joe, Suzanne, Martin, and Dot. And also standing at this lectern, I also owe the warmest, fullest gratitude to Debbie Swallow. Thank you for coming, Debbie, and thank you for all of your support and encouragement. Another difference between me and Thomas. Thomas's mother didn't come to his lecture, but mine is here. But incidentally, there are some comparisons. Like my mum, Countess Theodora was a formidable woman in both the sense of inspiring fear or respect and formidable Wow. So you can meet her after and test that against her. She never had me abducted, though. So just to be clear, if you know Thomas's life story, that's not a point of comparison. And the final comparison, I think, is that Thomas didn't use any slides, although the record is incomplete on that front. There are, though, some similarities. Like Thomas, I am a little bit awed by this occasion. And I'm very grateful to all of you for being here and for the warm friendship that I can feel around me today and, in fact, every day of my increasingly long life at the Courtauld. With rather different motivations, both Thomas and I borrowed our titles and our main themes from Old Testament texts. Thomas from Psalm 103, verse 13, while mine circles around and around Ecclesiastes 7, verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. And the final kind of point of comparison, I think, is that Thomas had great teachers, and so did I. Thomas had the mighty Albertus Magnus, and I had many teachers, some of whom are here in this room, and others who Tony has already mentioned. So what follows is obliquely, but in some ways maybe explicitly, an occasionally obscene, sometimes dry and technical, very heartfelt love letter to the teachers who made me a medievalist. Beginning with Steve Johnson, my grade 8 high school history teacher, who had to teach the Middle Ages and the feudal system from a book called Patterns of Civilization, burned into the back of my eyes. It's a miracle I became a medievalist, not because of that, not because of Steve, but because of the book. And later, at the University of Victoria, Michelle Mulcahy, who is watching online from Toronto, so hello Michelle, if you managed to click the link, Elizabeth Archibald, and John Osborne, whom Tony already mentioned. The Courtauld's medievalists turned me into an art historian. Joanna Cannon, Paul Crossley, Susie Nash, and as I say, above all, my wise, kind, inscrutable, brilliant, Yoda-like supervisor and later colleague, John Loudon. In his own inaugural in 2006, John made salad dressing out of the Courtauld medievalists. Paul was the olive oil, Susie the Dijon mustard, Joanna was the salt and the pepper, and John himself the vinegar. There are grave risks in trying to extend or transplant this metaphor, and I spent a few unhappy hours trying to work up some feeble catch-up gag, like we're all just trying to catch up, you know, like it didn't fly, so fortunately I haven't shared it with you. But I, and indeed we, owe the salad dressing ingredients who established a culture of warm friendship and incessant travel that benefits us all, and long may the traditions that they established flourish. If my teachers made me a medievalist, it's my students who've made me a teacher. Marking crises aside, and I think most of us are in the grip of one right now, aren't we, everybody? Teaching is the very best part of my job because of the brilliant, funny, curious students, like this group, this year's cohort of the Supernatural Middle Ages a few weeks ago in Canterbury. So that is more or less how my Oscar acceptance speech would have gone had the Academy not cold-shouldered my animated short about the life cycle of the barnacle. Still hurts. Only for an Oscar, I also would have talked over the music to thank my beloved husband, Jeremy, my children, my sister, my family and friends, and all of you who are here in spirit, in the room or online. So let's get on with some mirth. In the 13th and 14th centuries, there was a remarkable explosion of images in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, especially in England, France, and the Low Countries. Monsters that had hitherto usually been contained or even constrained by texts and borders, like this Plinian monster, or blemi, gripping on the miniature frame in this 11th century Wonders of the East, began to break free. By the 1260s, the blemi had escaped from the Wonders of the East, grown a beard, put on a purple skirt, acquired a crossbow, and invaded the border of Psalm 54 of the Rutland Psalter, along with a blue merman at the top of the border and a little dragon at the bottom. Irreverent, silly, satirical, scatological, monstrous, violent, and playful imagery was juxtaposed to deluxe copies of all kinds of texts: scripture, prayer books, school texts, saints' lives, romances. Sometimes these images relate to the text, playfully or otherwise, but in many cases they seem to be entirely unrelated, incongruous even, to some observers, chaotic. The margins of this Bible, copied by the scribe William of Devon, probably in the 1260s, offers a good example. The opening verses of Genesis are accompanied by a creation cycle, with a crucifixion at the bottom, all fair enough. But swarming around are parrots, cranes, a peacock, hounds chasing hares, a hunter shooting a rabbit, and monsters and animals dressed up like clerics and a cleric and a bishop. Perhaps this abundant creation is a response to the Genesis text, but maybe also it's poking a bit of fun at clerics, amusing, bemusing, and pleasing its viewers. Prayer books like this one, a tiny early 14th century book of hours, have margins full of antics of various kinds. Here we have a little dirty dancing, a Franciscan scraping away at bellows with a distaff, a barefooted nun hiking up her skirts and dancing to his terrible music. Are we mocking them? Are we joining them? Maybe a bit of both. No book serves as a better bellwether for 20th century attitudes towards the ridiculous margins of Gothic manuscripts than the Luttrell Psalter. Made for the Lincolnshire Lord, Geoffrey Luttrell, in several phases concentrated between the 1330s and 40s, this has been the subject of 2 facsimiles, several monographs, and a brace of important articles. In her 1954 survey, Painting in Britain, Margaret Rickert described its monsters as hideous and vulgar and lamented that its good illumination was often spoiled by a repulsive grotesque. Even relatively tame images have sometimes attracted critical comment. A perfectly innocent hill of snakes in the Luttrell Psalter, underneath the words of Psalm 103, provoked the great manuscript scholar Eric Millar to comment in his 1932 facsimile that the mind of a man who could deliberately set himself to ornament a book with such subjects as the reptile mound can hardly be normal. Such images tease anyone seeking a unifying meaning or scheme, whether in the context of a single page or on a macro-cultural scale. Often they seem to have been designed to startle, to amuse, to provoke, to laughter, but they also, as many scholars have shown, have other motivations as well. The great Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux is something of a lonely voice, as Paul Binski has pointed out, decrying images of unclean apes, fierce lions, monstrous centaurs, half-men, striped tigers, fighting soldiers and hunters blowing their horns, in a much-quoted, maybe over-quoted letter of 1125. For Bernard, such images in cloisters distracted the brothers from reading, leading them to marvel rather than to meditate. And then he follows that up with a kind of proto-Marxist critique of spending money on things like this rather than on the poor. Judging from the proliferation of ridiculous images, by which I mean images that provide mirth, laughter, merriment, ridicule, across all media in the generations that followed Bernard's celebrated text, his apologia appears to be about as successful as Mary Whitehouse's campaign to clean up TV. What on earth would Bernard have made of this extraordinary image of what Nigel Morgan delicately termed a man taking off his boot and warming himself in a calendar page in Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Meckham's Psalter? And what did it mean to Meckham? I wouldn't know about this were it not for Teresa Lane, so thank you. The astonishing proliferation of amusing images, more often than not in the margins of Gothic manuscripts, has generated a substantial literature, much of it heavily indebted to Lillian M.C. Randall's scholarship. In a landmark 1957 Art Bulletin article, Randall linked marginal imagery to the 13th century revolution in vernacular preaching, driven by the new mendicant orders, especially the Franciscans and the Dominicans. She demonstrated that many of the images in the margins of Gothic manuscripts were related very directly to the kinds of stories that preachers used to enliven their sermons, the spoonful of sugar that helped the medicine go down. Randall's observations about the causal relationship between preaching culture and Gothic art belongs in a historical narrative, or really a historiographic narrative, most famously expounded in Erwin Panofsky's 1944 lecture, Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism. Panofsky had argued that common habits of mind underpinned the simultaneous emergence of Gothic architecture and scholasticism, the method that systematically applied Aristotelian logic into the interpretation of the Bible, church doctrines, natural philosophy, and much else besides. If Panofsky addressed habits of mind in rather abstract terms, then Randall considered the practical relationship between the scholastic turn, which was powerfully motivated by teaching and preaching, and the boom in marginal imagery. For her, collections of preachers' exempla were a key part of this story, and mendicant preachers who were responsible for assembling some of the most important exempla and sermon collections were key. Ironically, many images satirized the preachers themselves, for example, by recasting St. Francis in his famous sermon to the birds as Reynard the fox, a bishop preacher who eats his flock. Randall's field-changing images in the margins of Gothic, or images in the margins of Gothic manuscripts, published in 1966, extended her analysis of the phenomenon in Gothic margins by providing an index to subjects found in more than 200 manuscripts, from A, Aaron, Abacus, Abbas, to Z, Zosimus, Zodiac, Zipporah. This heroic scholarly effort, we should all note, was conducted through microfiche, microfilm, and extensive travel, as well as manuscripts themselves, and it would still, I think, be very difficult to accomplish today. A particular hotspot for us is her entry on what she discreetly termed obsceni, sourced from about 50 manuscripts and filling 4 columns, with entries on terms such as beak aimed at genitals, defecating, comma, ape into bowl, and man nude, probing. Randall, so here's defecating man, by the way. There we have obsceni, defecating man, illustrated by a Flemish book of hours in Trinity College, Cambridge. Randall, of necessity, radically decontextualized marginal images for her index and its illustrations. Subsequent scholarship, aided by the digitization of manuscripts, has emphasized the recontextualizing of such images in relation to text, function, audience, space, semiotics, and more. If anything, recontextualizing amusingly revolting little images like this one makes them even more startling. This image, for example, accompanies the prayer said at Matins during the office of the dead, comforting, I suppose, to anyone mourning. Scholars contributing to the interpretation of mirthful Gothic images are too many to mention, but I do want to single out a few. Michael Camille's Image on the Edge, published in 1992, marked a critically important turn in the study of margins, not least for emphasizing the pleasures of raucous marginal imagery. For him, text and image were counterpoised. Things written down in the margins add an extra dimension, he wrote, a supplement that is able to gloss, parody, modernize, and problematize the text's authority, while never totally undermining it. In a characteristically erudite and sensitive response to scholarship on the Gothic edge in his 2014 Gothic Wonder, Paul Binski questioned the historical validity of margin as a term of analysis and encouraged interpretation that embraces pleasure, delight, and small group humor, in-jokes among clerics and elites, and something that I hope you won't mind me saying, I think Paul knows something about. When we visited Trump Tower together en route to cocktails in 2015, Paul revealed an extraordinary, precocious command of Trump-related puns and gags, all of which might have made good index entries in Lillian Randall's study. Here we are with Gary, my successor at the University of Kent. In a study of the Luttrell Psalter, Lucy, oh sorry, I've skipped a tiny little bit, I want to say a little encomium of my own to Lucy. Lucy Freeman Sandler is another fundamental scholar who's done so much to advance our understanding of Gothic art through her many publications and her talent for friendship with emerging and established scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. And here she is with my friend and her former student, Catherine Smith, also her successor at New York University, with the Queen Mary Psalter a few years ago. In a study of the lateral psalter, Lucy emphasized how artists played with words and part words, sometimes offering erudite glosses on the text, other times toying with it, so often doing both at the same time. The Gorleston Psalter, a Suffolk manuscript of the 1310s, offers some examples of how Lucy's approach can be applied to one of the other great East Anglian manuscripts, the Gorleston Psalter. I'm just going to whiz past the splendid Beatus page and cut straight to what might seem like an unpromising opening if you're looking for filth. But you won't be disappointed. My first example comes at Psalm 44, verse 9, which describes the delights of perfumes and princesses. The word delectaverant, they delighted, starts at the bottom of folio 60 and finishes at the top of 61 with taverant. A suspension mark indicates the missing ER, shown in brackets on this slide. The resulting part word could be read, if you wanted to, as the word taunt. And the artist, as you now will have seen, has come up with an image that I would describe as extreme mooning. Advanced mooning, maybe even, right above it. In Anglo-Norman French and Middle English, taunt could mean something like ton pour ton, tit for tat, as well as an insult, a provocation. The OED gives the first citation of this use of the word in the English language in 1499, but I think the Gorleston Psalter beats this precedent by about 120 years. So is this an obscene little word game, giving the psalm reader a naughty little eyeful, something to taunt, something to delight, to please, amuse, charm, and lure? You can do this again on another page. The artist plays a similar polyglot word game with Psalm 65, verse 10, deconstructing the word examinasti, you examined, across a page divide. Just above the syllable nasty, we find a naked, crouching bishop. All of you will have seen this when booking your tickets for this evening, I think, who is, and I admit it is a little hard to find the right words, taking a confession from a bare-bottomed, farting monk. In any case, the image responds both to the Latin meaning of the word, examinasti, in the sense of an examination or confession, as well as to the Middle and modern English sense of the word, another English word that the Gorleston Psalter helps us to redate. The smudges across the bishop maybe hint that someone at some point objected to this image. And you don't have to be Bernard of Clairvaux or Mary Whitehouse to feel a little startled to see the sacred tangled up with the profane like this. Indeed, discomfort with mirth and its association with fools was hardwired into the Christian worldview. When I read Edith Wharton's 1905 novel, The House of Mirth, in my early 20s, pre-Google, I admired the title's poetic metaphor, but I didn't recognize it as a phrase from the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. Wharton gives no explanation in the text or paratext. She either assumed her readers would recognize the words or she didn't care. Her tale charts the course, the incremental destruction even, of beautiful, witty, penniless socialite Lily Bart. The novel is populated with high net worth mirth lovers and their less moneyed associates, migrating from one grand New England mansion to another. Lily clinging on for dear life, racking up gambling debts, potential husband slipping through her fingers, her reputation assured. It might seem at first that Wharton's novel revels in the House of Mirth, but in the end it's clear that Wharton was very much against it. A cradle Episcopalian and eventual Catholic convert, entitling her novel, Wharton would certainly have had in mind the King James translation published in 1611. The King James translators seem to have lifted the words of this verse directly from Miles Coverdale's 1535 Bible. This is, anyway, the earliest English language translation of this form of words that I can find. And it would, I think, be instructive to run the King James Version through plagiarism detection software like Turnitin. But that, I think, is a problem for another committee of the Courtauld. Coverdale and his King James imitators were clearly taken with the paired house metaphor of verse 7 7, verse 3 of the Latin Vulgate, which has the house of mourning paired with the house of feasting. A couple of lines later, Coverdale sharpens up his text by adding another pair of houses which aren't quite there in the Vulgate text, putting the wise in the house of mourning and the fool in the house of mirth. Wharton's critique of the corrupting effects of worldly goods and pleasures is in sync not just with Ecclesiastes' own rather jaundiced worldview, but also a deep tradition stretching back at least to the Church Fathers. So what does the book of Ecclesiastes have to say about laughter, mirth, and joy? Written in Hebrew, probably in the 5th century BC, in the Middle Ages, many considered it to have been written by King Solomon himself. If the erotic, hedonistic Song of Songs was written in Solomon's sybaritic youth, medieval commentators that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes as a jaded, self-critical old king. Thomas Aquinas, in fact, in his inaugural, said that Ecclesiastes aims at contempt of the world. Here, Thomas echoed Jerome, translator of Ecclesiastes from Hebrew into Latin, who in 388 wrote, "I read Ecclesiastes to the saintly Blycilla, so that I might provoke her to the contempt of this earthly scene, and to count as nothing all that she saw in the world." And to find out how that worked out for Blycilla, Google her, because it was not a positive thing for her. Ecclesiastes has almost nothing positive to say about mirth, merriment, or laughter. Describing his rejection of wine, gardens, ponds, silver, gold, singing women, and all the other pleasures and vanities of the world, the author says, "I said in my heart, I will abound with delights and enjoy a good thing. And I saw that this was vanity. Laughter I counted error, and to mirth I said, why art thou vainly deceived?" Later he says that anger is better than laughter. Clearly he had never attended a Courtauld Institute of Art academic board, where I think we would put that in reverse. In any case, he also said that laughter is best left for fools. For, he says, as the crackling of thorns burning under a pot, so is the laughter of a fool. And of course, there is the verse of my title. In the Douay-Rheims faithful translation, not of the Hebrew, but of Jerome's Latin, the heart of the wise is where there is mourning, and the heart of fools is where there is mirth. In Luke's account of the Beatitudes, Christ himself echoes Ecclesiastes, "Blessed are ye that weep now, for you shall laugh." And later, "Woe unto you that now laugh, for you shall mourn and weep." In this wonderful Bible, in the Morgan, probably made in northeastern France in the 1270s, the historiated initial marking the start of Ecclesiastes shows a kingly preacher sensed by an angel addressing kneeling listeners. And in the margin, a shocked little gryllus listens in, back turned on the preacher. Ecclesiastes is not alone, of course, among biblical texts in its critique of mirth, joy, pleasure, and laughter. Biblical laughter is sometimes sardonic, such as the secret, incredulous laugh of Sarah when she's told by 3 mysterious visitors that she and Abraham, by then far advanced in years, will have a child. When Sarah heard, she laughed behind the door of the tent. And interrogated by God, why did Sarah laugh? She fearfully denies it. "Nay, but thou didst laugh," she's cross-examined. Sarah's laugh is commemorated in her child's name, Isaac, laughter in Hebrew. And here, in the Bodleian volume of the Oxford, Paris, London Bible Moralise, the artist rises to the challenge of depicting Sarah's inward laugh. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, Esther entreats God not to reward those who might laugh at our ruin. In Proverbs, fools laugh at sin. In the Psalms, the Lord laughs at sinners, the just laugh at the wicked, and the psalmist prays that foes not laugh at him, and then threatens his enemies with laughter. Very occasionally, medieval images supply a bit of laughter where the text merely implies it. The most extraordinary example I know is the treatment of the drunkenness of Noah in the Egerton Genesis, an incomplete picture book made in England in the 1360s. According to Genesis 9, after the flood, Noah plants a vineyard and inadvertently, not realizing that wine has intoxicating powers, gets drunk. He passes out and, in the words of Genesis 9:21, lays naked in his tent. Ham sees Noah and tells his brothers, who cover Noah up very carefully without looking. When Noah awakes, he curses Ham for the crimes of looking, telling, and not covering, making him a servant of servants to his brothers forever, a curse that has a long, chilling afterlife. The Egerton Genesis provided a gloss on Ham's crime in word and image. Ham laughs, he points, he entreats Sem to laugh also, and his brother shields his eyes, and then, just like in the Genesis text, goes backwards, face turned away, to cover Noah. The French inscription explains that Ham mocked his father. So the Egerton Genesis thus not only offers a supplement to the story as recounted in the Vulgate, but also puts the viewer in a predicament. Anyone amused by this arrestingly frank image of Noah and also the suggestive grape clusters would, in effect, be guilty of the same crime as Ham. So whatever you do, don't laugh at this one. Laughter, levity, and mirth in its various forms were decried in biblical and patristic sources, banned by monastic rules, and critiqued by figures like Bernard of Clairvaux. And yet we find mirthful, silly, subversive images in all kinds of media. Manuscripts preserve them best, but there are examples in just about every medium that you can think of. Textile, gold, ivory, stone, and, as in the celebrated 8 funeral window in the nave of York Minster, stained glass as well. Prohibition clearly didn't work. It seldom does. But how did images like York's fox preaching to a chicken next to an ape's funeral cortege make it into sacred spaces? And here's a detail of what's going on in that window. Alongside the anti-mirth invective, another tradition recognized and harnessed the power of laughter to elevate and to persuade. The influential pseudo-Ciceronian Rhetorica ad Herenium, written in the 1st century BC, advocates laughter as a way to catch the attention and relieve hearers who've been fatigued by listeners like you. Medieval preachers and rhetoricians developed this case. In the much-read Poetria Nova of 1200, Geoffrey of Vinsauf recommends that comedy, inherently an immature form, was especially suited to the young. And in the 13th century, Thomas of Cobham advocated the use of amusing exempla to arouse solace and even laughter. Sermon and exempla collections from the 13th century are rich in comic anecdotes, such as this one, which might alarm my own husband, Jack de Vitry's tale of a woman who rids herself of a despised husband by getting him drunk and telling some monks that he's dying and wants to join holy orders. But when he wakes up, incarcerated in a monastery, he's too embarrassed to explain and winds up staying there. De Vitry no doubt expected such stories to amuse his audience, yet some of his exempla retain a complex, maybe even disquieting, view of laughter. For example, he retells a story from Gregory the Great. Gregory, he says, tells of a girl who saw the Blessed Virgin with a band of other virgins and longed to be with them. The Virgin said to her, "If you will not laugh for 30 days, you shall be with us." The girl refrained from laughter for 30 days and then died, receiving, no doubt, the promised glory. So to my eye, this is a very disconcerting story. A lack of mirth will get you a place in heaven, but if you don't laugh for 30 days, it will kill you. So, a warning. So the playbill for this lecture promised some Thomas Aquinas, and I'm sure that's why most of you are here. But where does Thomas come into medieval laughter ethics? Before telling you, we are going to race through his life story. Thomas Aquinas was born about 1224 at his family's castle at Roccasecco in the Lazio region of central Italy. Aged about 6, he was sent to the mighty Benedictine house of Monte Cassino, where he was an oblate. At Monte Cassino, until he was 15, Thomas would have known well the Benedictine rules, prohibition on useless or mirth-provoking words, and also the condemnation of much or excessive laughter. At about 15, he went to Naples to study, and a few years later, in 1244, he took the Dominican habit. His family, including his aforementioned formidable mother, was very much against his Dominican career. So they abducted him and kept him at Roccasecca and tried to provoke him and torment him and taunt him with beautiful women and the like, trying to dissuade him from his Dominican vocation. But by the autumn of 1245, they gave up, and he was returned to the Dominicans. Probably everyone was relieved. He then went to Paris for the first time, where he studied with Albertus Magnus. And he followed Albertus Magnus to Cologne to teach and continue his studies before going back to Paris in 1251. He remained at Paris for most of the 1250s, completing his doctorate in 1256, and then worked as a Regent Master until returning to Italy, maybe to Naples, before then going on to Orvieto and then on to Rome, where in 1265 he devised a new curriculum entirely of his own devising, and something that Leonard Boyle and Michel Mulcahy have investigated in very interesting terms. And then, as part of that project, began to work on the Summa Theologiae. Probably, if you know one work by Thomas, that will be it. This monumental three-part project occupied him until he stopped writing a few months before his death. Thomas completed the first book of his Summa in Rome, and then he returned to Paris in 1268, where he began to work on the second. And it's worth pausing for just a second to consider Thomas's 3 Paris sojourns. In his long stints in Paris, Thomas always stayed in the Dominican convent in the Rue Saint-Jacques, there it is, known as the Jacobins. The University of Paris grew up around this convent, and if he ever lifted his eyes from his books, Thomas would have seen the efflorescence of Gothic art and architecture all around him, with buildings like Notre Dame and the Sainte-Chapelle continued during his lifetime. In 1273, Thomas left Paris for the last time, returning to Naples, where he worked on the Summa until he stopped writing altogether in 1273, leaving the third part incomplete. And he died the following year at the Cistercian convent at Fossanova on his way to the Council of Lyon. Thomas's Summa was intended as a comprehensive manual of theology, aimed, so he claims, at beginners, a claim that sometimes people don't believe because it is very long and very complicated, but that was, I think, genuinely his intention. In it, he systematically tackles some of the biggest, most perplexing problems arising from the human condition and from Christian doctrine. Organized as a series of questions, Thomas asks things like, does God exist? What are angels made of? What is the soul? Do people have free will? Others, most notably Umberto Eco, have written about Thomas's thoughts on beauty, which are scattered throughout the Summa Theologiae and his other writings. And it's worth acknowledging that although, as we've seen, Thomas had a ringside seat to the burgeoning visual arts in Italy, in France, and Germany during the 13th century, he doesn't appear to have been a very visual man. But what interests me is less what Thomas thought about art, and instead what he thought about mirth, and how his thinking might give us an angle on amusing images in Gothic art. As noted earlier, as a child, Thomas was steeped in the laughter-forbidding Benedictine rule, and after becoming a Dominican in 1244, he would have followed its rule, which also forbade laughter. The Dominican friar was forbidden to laugh or guffaw or intend to provoke others to laugh or guffaw by his buffoonery, words, or actions. He was not to revel in levity of mind by letting his eyes wander or behaving in an irreligious manner, during the divine offices in particular, or to laugh in choir or make others laugh. So it's particularly interesting to see how Thomas tackles questions about mirth, play, and pleasure. He does so in the second part of the Summa, known as the Secunda Secundae. Father Leonard Boyle himself, a mirthful Dominican and teacher of my teacher, Michel Mulcahy, characterized the Secunda Secundae as a straight summa of virtue and vices, a summa of moral theology. And he demonstrated that it circulated independently, reaching a far wider readership than the rest of Thomas's Summa. Near the end of Thomas's disquisition on temperance, he explores questions about virtue and vice in the context of topics including food, sex, studiousness, dress, and the emotions, including laughter. Humans are a laughing animal, he thinks, for whom laughter is an essential accident. He says we cannot be without having the faculty of laughing. In this position, he was directly indebted to the discussion of pleasure, on which he wrote a commentary. Thomas cautions against excessive laughter on various grounds. In normal circumstances, he says joy is increased by laughter, but excess laughter decreases it. He advises that humility requires outward checking laughter and other signs of senseless mirth. Excessive laughter is a sin, if only a venial one. So far, so predictable. But then Thomas knuckles down to consider outward movements of the body. He begins by arguing that serious physical movement can be virtuous, and then he asks whether there might be virtue in playful movement also. He observes, following Aristotle, that man must rest his body for physical refreshment because he cannot work without intermission. Masculine pronouns retained, by the way. Rest is also necessary following intellectual labor, which Thomas recognizes as a form of physical work, as it uses abilities that operate through physical organs. Just as bodily tiredness is by sleep and relaxation, so spiritual fatigue is erased by resting the soul, he says. Echoing Aristotle, Thomas identifies pleasure as rest for the soul and advises slackening the tension of mental study and taking some pleasure. Pleasure is equated with play, which Thomas defines in another direct lift from Aristotle as words and deeds, which nothing is sought beyond the soul's pleasure. Thomas concludes that there can be a moral virtue about playing. In the last article on the topic of play, Thomas asks if there is sin in a lack of play. Is it a sin to not play, to have a defect of playfulness? He notes the example of holy people who are praised from having refrained from mirth, and Old Testament verses that decry jest, many of which we've already heard. But following the question, resolving the question, Thomas follows Aristotle's view that a lack of play is vicious in the sense of being full of vice. He says, he says, unreasonable for a person to be burdensome to others by offering no pleasure to others and by hindering their enjoyment. Moreover, those who are deficient in playfulness are uncultivated and rude. He's careful to point out that it is a greater sin to play too much than too little, but he's emphatic that there is sin in a lack of mirth. Now, I can't help reading Thomas's thoughts on work and play through the lens of his own biography. He started the second part of the Summa in around 1270 in Paris and finished it 2 years later in Naples, somehow carrying on this vast project amidst arduous travel, teaching, and many other tasks and obligations. Thomas finished the Secunda Secundae in 1272 and then spent the next year working on the third and final part of the Summa. On the 6th of December, 1273, aged about 50, Thomas suddenly permanently stopped writing, leaving the third part of his Summa unfinished. According to his secretary, Brother Reginald, after a vision, Thomas said, "I can write no more. All that I have written is like so much straw." And at this point, Thomas had written an estimated 8 million words, just about plausible before the invention of email. Chaired countless disputations, attended numerous meetings, and walked maybe as many as 15,000 miles between Naples, Rome, Orvieto, Paris, and Cologne. It's hard to infer personal experience or indeed personality in Thomas's writing, but is there perhaps a whisper of exhaustion, an empathy for the exhausted in his approach to laughter as essential, the virtue of play, the value of mirth, and the sin of mirthlessness? Modern scholars, including Weisseipel and Torrell, suspected that whatever the immediate causes of Thomas's death, the thing that really killed him was overwork. His thoughts about rest and play came, I think, from a very human place, and also from Aristotle. But how widely known were his thoughts in the Middle Ages? Boyle demonstrated that the Secunda Secundae was by far the most popular part of the Summa, accounting for something like 37% of the 600 manuscripts that he knew containing one or more parts of this text. It would be hard to prove that medieval artists or patrons knew Thomas's thoughts on mirth or thought about images in relation to it. But on the other hand, it may be instructive to turn, for example, to the lateral psalter. There's a strong Dominican presence in the images of this manuscript, such as this Dominican friar hearing a nun's confession. And in one of the most famous images in the Psalter, Geoffrey Luttrell feasts with his household. Michael Camille, and maybe others, suggested that the Dominicans at the end of this table must be two of Luttrell's confessors. It's been suggested by numerous scholars, Lucy Sandler, Janet Backhouse, Michael Camille, Michelle Brown, that these Dominicans may well have guided the program of illumination in the book. Dominicans in the early 14th century would almost certainly have had to study the Secunda Secundae, and who knows, maybe they brought a copy of this Summa of Moral Theology to Lincolnshire with them. In any case, maybe it's not so far-fetched to think that Thomas's ideas about the merits of mirth as a form of rest might have been in the minds of the people that determined the program for this extraordinary and extraordinarily mirthful manuscript. And how extraordinary it is that we still enjoy the lateral psalter, debate its meanings, indeed more than ever in this digital age. Over our lifetimes, the most extraordinary technological transformation has engulfed us, one with implications even more enormous than the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century. I vividly recall being told about the existence of the internet at a dinner party in 1992. At the same dinner party, the existence of email was also revealed. I realized then how terrible it would be. Anyway, another story. During my PhD, I relied on microfilms, the Conway's Photographic Archive printed books and manuscripts. There were a few digital e-resources, remember CD-ROMs, everyone? But Google didn't come into being until I was in my first post-PhD job at the British Library, working on what became the catalogue of illuminated manuscripts. We've only just started to discover what the effects and side effects of the mass digitization of cultural heritage will be. 25 years on from the rise of Google, we're in the equivalent of 1475. A moment of frenzied exchange between old and new media, illuminators working on both printed books and manuscripts, streaming Spotify while collecting vinyl. The Middle Ages have so far done very well in the digital realm. Medievalists turned out to be early adopters, and in fact I see Andrew Prescott here, one of the leading early adopters, editing hypertexts, compiling databases, digitizing manuscripts, and cataloging museum collections online, collaborating across fields, institutions, periods. These efforts have opened up the Middle Ages, often in tiny, disorientating doses to an enormous audience, some of whom are inspired to dig deeper, find out more, come and study at the Courtauld. But then there are the side effects. We know that a parchment manuscript can survive in remarkable condition for more than 1,000 years. Take the Codex Amiatinus, the lone surviving example of the three single-volume Bibles made at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow in the early 8th century, and the earliest surviving manuscript of the complete Bible translated into Latin by St. Jerome. Its maker, Ceolfrith, escorted this book to Rome, but he, and presumably the donkey carrying it, died before it got there, and it wound up in Florence. In 2018, my inspirational friend Claire Bray, meet her after the lecture, head of medieval manuscripts at the British Library, persuaded the Laurentiana to loan the Codex Amiatinus to the BL's landmark Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms show, its first return to Britain in more than 1,300 years. On a donkey-crushing scale that has to be seen to be believed, many aspects of this book cannot really be conveyed digitally. Anyway, my point is that we know that the Codex Amiatinus can survive in very good nick for at least 1,300 years, but we don't know if digital images of it will be available tomorrow. In fact, we can be pretty sure that they won't be. We can be pretty sure that many of the resources that we've all come to rely on, like the BL's Catalogue of Illuminated Manuscripts, the project on which I cut my own postdoctoral teeth, its landing page, so steady over the 2 decades since I left in 2004, won't be available, at least not for some time, following the ransomware attack that took down the BL's digital estate last October. In pointing this out, I'm not picking on the BL, quite the opposite. It's an institution that has a claim to at least 1/4 of my own cardiac real estate. I could also cite the infrastructure issue, as they call it, that has immobilized the digital Bodleian on and off throughout the month of March. These institutions deserve, and indeed require, investment to safeguard the digital assets that in the end belong to us all. Images in medieval manuscripts were made for the age of social media. This is the image on the edge for our times, the endless stream of quips, questions, reflections, little fights, images that add dimension, a supplement that gloss, parody, modernize, and problematize. Another dimension of digital fragility is the ephemerality of social media, which runs through our fingers like sand. One of the most successful accounts majoring in medieval manuscripts is Weird Medieval Guys on Twitter and Instagram, which mines digital manuscript collections to find weird, silly, unexpected images, presented with a few words and no extraneous matter, no dates, places, shelf marks, folio numbers. At its most benign, this feed and others like it are maybe, in Thomas's terms, a form of play as rest, a bit of amusement, the incidental expansion of one's horizons. A few days after the BL cyber attack, coincidentally, Square Peg published a little book just in time for the Christmas market that materialized this Instagram feed in codex form. And if you pick this book up, wanting to learn more about the Middle Ages, manuscripts, or art, you'll be annoyed. But if you are interested in the story of how media shapes civilization and vice versa, it has a kind of potency. In late antiquity, book producers shifted from roll to codex. From the late 1990s, we've returned to scrolling, a phenomenon explored very brilliantly in Jack Hartnell's fascinating collection of essays, Continuous Page, available freely on Courtauld Books Online. From this perspective, the phenomenon of the social media account materializing as a printed book marks a fascinating shift. Weird Medieval Guys not only shows the potential for the commodification of open source media, it also gestures towards a time when we might rely on the printed book as evidence of the fugitive social media feed. And it's not just printed books that still seem like quite a good idea. Last weekend, to reassure myself that I can finish a book even if the BL situation doesn't resolve, I dug out my old microfilm of the Smithfield Decretals, photographed more than 50 years ago, before the British Library was even born. This journey that Gothic images have made from manuscript to print to pixel underscores for me how vital it is that we continue to study and strive to preserve cultural heritage in all of these forms. So I started this lecture talking about Thomas Aquinas and went on for quite a while about the Book of Ecclesiastes, and it looks like I'm finishing with a picture of an unfurled microfilm, which is a risky game plan for a lecture that is ostensibly about mirth. So let me end in a slightly different way. I've emphasized the dourest, most mirth-crushing passages from Ecclesiastes in this lecture. But there's another view of laughter in this richly contradictory ancient text. If Edith Wharton highlighted Ecclesiastes 7:3 for Belle Epoque readers, then the birds ensured that their grandchildren were more familiar with Ecclesiastes 3, best known in the 1960s through the anti-war song Turn, 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 which topped the charts in 1965 and has been on the soundtrack of pretty much every film about the Vietnam War ever since. But people my age probably came across Ecclesiastes courtesy of Kevin Bacon. In the 1984 film Footloose, which I saw on a rented VCR at a slumber party with my best friends Karen, Emily, and Sarah, who I think are watching from various places in Canada, Ren, played by Kevin Bacon, moves to a small town in southwestern USA, with evangelical zeal has banned music and dancing. In the film's dramatic climax, Ren / Kevin Bacon argues that there should be a high school prom to the town council, quoting pro-dance verses from the Psalms, from the Book of Samuel, and from Ecclesiastes. Addressing the stony-faced townspeople, Ren / Kevin Bacon says, Ecclesiastes assures us that there is a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to laugh, a time to weep, a time to mourn, and there is a time to dance. They do let him have the dance. You can see the film. Who could have predicted that 30 years later, the Dean and Chapter of Canterbury Cathedral would be cast in Kevin Bacon's role, arguing about the merits of a rave in the nave to the mirthless town elders, or in the case of the civilization that we're now in, the Daily Mail. Perhaps it goes to show another bit of Ecclesiastes, that there is nothing new under the sun, but I think we can take strength from that. So now, let us follow the advice of Thomas Aquinas and Kevin Bacon and laugh and dance together and celebrate friendship and the coming of spring and the end of term and the end of this inaugural lecture.